Now today we are going to try to implement map data structure where map is just like an object, but there is a few difference that separates map and object. And just like an object, map is a collection of key value pairs. But map allows keys of any type, and map is ordered, meaning the order of insertion of elements are kept. If you guys find this helpful, make sure you guys like and subscribe. Thanks. Now, before actually implementing our map and their methods, I want to go over one thing, and that's going to be the fact that our implementation of map is not going to be complete. It's going to lack a little compared to regular maps. And the reason is because, well, our map isn't going to take any types of keys. It's just going to take numbers and strings, and it's not going to be ordered. So it's very limited, but I think this is a good practice just to get started. So first thing, we want to create our map class, and we want to have two properties. One is store and one is length. So let's get our constructor and pass in two properties. First one being store, and this is going to be equal to an empty object, and this is where we are going to store our elements. Next, we want the length property to keep the length of our map. So this is it for map. So let's try instantiating a new instance. So const, I'll call it map, and this is going to be new maps. And if you were to console log map, you can see that we have our store and our length. And if you want to see our different methods, what you have to do is you will console log object get on property names, and we're going to pass in our map. And if you do prototype, you can see that we have our methods printed here. And obviously we haven't implemented them yet, but we will do so one by one. But these are the methods listed over here. Now let's try to implement our has method, and this is going to check if our map has the key that's going to be passed in. If it does, it's going to return true. If not, it's going to return false. So for this one, what we'll do is we'll use return this dot store, and we want to use a method called has on property and pass in our key. And if it was the case that our store had the key, it's going to return true, and if not, it's going to return false. So let's try our code, and right now we don't have any elements, so obviously it's going to return false. So let's do map.has, and let's try passing in 1. Should return false, and we should console log this. And as you can see, we have false because we don't have any elements right now. Now let's try to implement our set method where it's going to take a key value pair, and it's going to store that if it doesn't exist already. So first, what we have to do is we have to check, well, does the key exist? Well, if it does, we just want to return because we can't have keys of the same thing. And then if that's not the case, we want to store our key value pair and increment the length by 1 because we added one more element. First, we have to check if our store has the key, and it should be this dot key. If that's true, we just want to return. If not, we want to store our element. So this dot store at key is equal to the value. So we're storing our key value pairs, and we want to increment our length by 1 each time. Okay, so that looks good. Okay, let's do map.set. We'll try to add 1 and 1, and let's console log our map over here. So you can see that we have our key value pairs 1 and 1. What if we try map.set 2 and 2? You can see that we have our elements. And then next, let's try to do map.set 0 and 0. You can see that we have our zeros in our store. So that's looking good. And let's try to bring has down here and see if it returns true, because we actually have 1 in our store. And as you can see, it returned true. Now let's implement our get method where we return a value if the key exists. If not, we'll just return out of it. So we have to first check whether the key exists or not. So we use if this dot has the key. So if it doesn't have the key, we'll just return. And next we want to just return this dot store key. And let's try our code. So let's just uncomment this and we'll just use console log. Let's try map.get. Let's try getting number 2. So that should give us undefined because it doesn't have that value. And let's try getting 0. So that should return 0. Let's try getting 2 and you can see that it returned our value. So our get method looks good. Now let's try to implement our delete method where we remove the value by the key that's given, and we are going to return true if it's deleted, else we are going to return false. If you want, you can actually return the value if you want, the value that we deleted, but that's totally up to you. So first we want to check if the key exists or not. If it doesn't, we want to return false because there's nothing to delete. And next, we want to actually delete the key value pair, decrement the length by 1, and finally return true. So first, we have to check if it exists. So does it have the key? If it doesn't, we are going to return false. And we should have a logical not operator here. And next, let's delete the element. So that's going to be this dot store, and we pass in our key. That looks good. And we want to decrement our length by 1 because we deleted an element. And finally, return true. That looks good. Let's try our code. Let's try console log map.delete, and let's try deleting 1. So that returned true because we have 1 in our store. You can see that number 1 is gone. And let's try deleting something that's not in there. So let's try deleting 3. And you can see that that's returning false because we don't have 3 in our map. Now let's implement our keys method where we return an array of keys. So first thing we want to do is we want to create a variable to store our keys, and that's going to be an empty array. And then we want to iterate through our object and add all the keys to our output array. And finally return the array of keys. So first, let's create an array. Let's call it output, and this is going to be set to an empty array. And now we want to be able to iterate through our object. So to do that, we will use a for in loop. So const key in this dot store. Now we want to push in the element. So that's going to be output dot push, and we push in our key. And finally, return the array of our keys. So now let's try our code. So let's delete this. Console log map.keys, and you can see that it returned an array of all the elements in our map object. So we have 0, 1, and 2. Now let's implement our values method where it returns an array of values in our map object. First, we want to create a variable to store our values, and that's going to be an empty array, which we are going to return later. And next, we want to iterate through all the values in our object and add that to our output. So first, let's create our output array, and let's return that here. And now let's iterate through our object. So to do that, we will use for in loop. So key in our store. We want to push our values to our output array. So push, and we are going to get the values by accessing the store and the key. So that looks good. And let's try running our code. Console log map.values. And you can see that we got an array of the values that we have. And let's try adding one more element because the values and the keys are the same. So let's do 3, and then we'll overwrite this with 3. And you can see that we have our values and keys and correct elements. Now let's implement our clear method where we set our map to its initial state. So what we have to do is we have to set our store to its initial value, which is an empty object. And the next is our length, and we just set that to 0. And that's it for our clear method. So let's try if that worked. So go down here and then let's do map.clear, and you should expect every element to be removed. And as you can see, our store is empty and our length is set to 0. Now let's implement our size method where we simply just return the number of elements in our map object. And if you remember, we keep a track of number of our elements using the length property. So we just simply have to return length property. So let's try it out. Let's uncomment this. So we would expect a length of 4. So let's do console log map.size, and it should return 4. And you can see that it returned 4. So that's it for our size method. If you guys find this helpful, make sure you guys like and subscribe. Thanks.